It gives me great pleasure right now to introduce Stuart Ashman, who is the president and CEO of the Museum of Latin American Art. Stuart, I consider a friend and an incredible community partner in Long Beach. So, Stuart.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome. I want to echo Brian's welcome to you. I know you've been here, you've been working on this for a couple of days, and I really want to acknowledge you for the important work that you're doing. You know, one of the things that is our role as museum people is to educate the public about the sanctity of public art. I think these are not playground objects. These are things that need to be respected in the same way you respect religious icons. I moved here from New Mexico, and one of the things that made it certain that you weren't going to get graffitied is if you included the Virgin of Guadalupe. And so people are, you know, very respectful of religious icons, and so art is a religion in a way. When you came in, you probably saw this rhinoceros that we have, and shamefully, we have it roped off with signs. This is a piece that was made, it's called Hecho en Cuba. It was made by a Cuban artist. It came in 5 crates. It weighs 2,800 pounds, and it's an engineering feat how the thing is put together, because you assemble all the pieces of this rhinoceros, and then a small person gets inside and holds the nut while somebody outside tightens the bolts. Well, we had it out, and you know, it's cast aluminum, so we thought this piece is safe forever. But it's amazing how people handle it. And so the one thing with the rhinoceros is the horn. And so now the horn is loose. A couple of the trumpets have broken off from people hanging on them. So we're going to do some conservation on it. And then our temporary attempt at a solution is to create a curb 4 feet out from it and fill it with gravel and then put signs on the ground, and hopefully that will protect it. But that's some of the issues that we face with these pieces. And we want to share them. You know, we don't want them, you know, down in the vaults, but those are some of the issues that we face as a museum. For myself, you know, early in my career, before I had kids and had to have a paycheck, I did some public art myself. And this is another aspect, I think, of the education that you can provide artists is durability, because I really didn't care about that. So I worked with wood, metal, and these were outdoor pieces. And inevitably, they always had problems. New Mexico is where I lived and worked, and New Mexico has great rules about public art. The contracts say that you as the artist have to provide the conservation and maintenance plan for this piece, and if you can't be involved in it, then maintenance staff from the facility can be involved and in consultation with you, and if you're not available, then they can alter the piece, and then you can inspect the piece, and if they altered it beyond what you accept, then you can take your name off the piece. I mean, there's all these complicated legal issues. Anyway, again, I just want to welcome you for being here. I hope you have a wonderful day. This looks like an incredible workshop and panel. Brian is an amazing, as he said, partner in the community. We're honored to have you here, so enjoy it.
So the galleries are going to be open today after our conference, so Stuart set up some tours for us. And right behind us, beyond the check-in table, if you go through those doors into the main lobby, there will be docents there if you'd like to take a tour of the exhibitions, or you're able to go through on your own. Okay. So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Cara Starke today. When we first started talking about this project, she was the director of exhibitions at Creative Time, New York's visionary public art presenter. And since that time, she has now become the director of the Pulitzer Art Institute of St. Louis. So it's real an honor to welcome you today. And I want to invite Cara up to the stage now.
Good morning. Nice turnout for a Sunday morning. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for inviting me this morning. I'm excited to be moderating this panel with this terrific group of artists. I'll start by saying that public art and its production involves a lot of people. There's the artist, or perhaps a collective artist. There might be collaborators. Sorry, I hear it echoing. It's good? Great. There might be a producing partner, a commissioning agency. There's likely a funder, or perhaps set of funders. There's certainly a site, an owner, a proprietor. And this is all before the artwork may even begin its production or realization. And then there's another set of people. There's the public that engages, makes up the work, is part of its dialogue, and how it's received. And this public is certainly not singular, and it's deeply complicated, and presumably that is a large part of what we mean when we say public art. And we know that public art assumes many different forms, from sculpture to gesture, installation to conversation. And artists are increasingly making temporary spaces, interruptions in our daily life that offer us a platform for dialogues, opportunities to engage, and ways to really reimagine our world. And they're doing this in spaces and sites that are deeply complicated. There's incredibly layered histories to public spaces. There's systems of power, cultural nuance, and any given space as a platform is very deeply connected to these histories and spaces. On the plus side, or maybe it's not a counterpoint to it, but on the other hand, these are also spaces for potential real social change. Artists and cultural producers are understanding that power is increasingly no longer positioning art in culture, but also as a means to intervene in culture and participate with culture. And this is a moment when artists and producers are not just targeting communities and parachuting in, but they're really working within systems, embedding themselves or their practice in our daily lives and shared spaces. So the process of creating work for public space means not just a deeper appreciation of site, history, context, but also a question of all of these people that make up the artwork, that experience the artwork. And who are these publics, individuals, communities, and how might we engage with them, ignore them, invite them? As another aspect of it, a lot of artists are inviting the public to actually become more than just consumers, and that increasingly involved in making and completing a work and actively shaping an artwork through their own responses and engagement. This might and hopefully results in a heightened relationship between public and art, and the possibility that these artworks therefore resonate more deeply with us. And another result is really transformation. The public informs these projects. These works evolve. And this is true for all types of media. I know we've been talking a lot about conservation and media evolving in a public space, but more so for artworks that enable audience to really become active agents. It's also especially true with our means of dissemination and debate, especially with social media offering an opportunity for audiences to experience artworks from afar through their mediated devices. And public art can take on a life of its own once the public takes hold. So the question for us this morning is, how do artists approach this process of making new work for public engagement? What questions are they facing? Today, this morning, hopefully we'll touch upon a few of those. We have 3 artists with us: Paul Ramirez Jonas, Suzanne Lacy, and Jon Rubin. Now, you should have their bios already in your pamphlet, so I'm not going to go through their bios, but I'll give you a little bit of the framework so that you know what to expect. Each artist is going to come and share a focused presentation, 1 to 2 projects, and delve into a particular question. And then we'll have an opportunity for the group to discuss and then open it up to the full audience. So with that, I'd love to invite Paul to the stage. And thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the dialogue with all of you.
We only have roughly 10 minutes each, so I'm going to text while I speak. No, I'm going to set up my timer so I don't exceed my time for too much. Okay, so I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for waking up relatively early on a Sunday. And I wanted to frame this question, how many participants are enough, by speaking about 2 projects that I did pretty much at the same time. One was very large and one was very small. One had no curator or institution and was just completely funded out of my own pocket, and the other one had a prestigious institution funding it and helping me do it. And there is something that happens with, let's call it studio-based practice, which is that even just a handful of connoisseurs can be enough to make that work important. And when the work goes into the public sphere, there's often a demand that it satisfies certain democratic demands, that it be for everyone at all times, almost indiscriminately. And what are the consequences of that? How many participants are enough to make a work of art successful? Oh, that button was not it. Let's try this. Point it at myself. There we go. I'm the machine. So the first project, these are from 2010, had only 69 participants. It had a handful of spectators, maybe as many spectators as there were participants, and almost no secondary audience, meaning there was no diffusion in magazines or publications or journals after the fact, except this type of delivery, where I will deliver the story of that project to you. So, you know, right now, that secondary audience is going to grow a little longer. Bigger. The project was called Dictar en Recordar, and it's the only project I've done in the country that I'm from, in Honduras. Honduras has a peculiar history in that it has more governments than years of independence. So when we were children, we would learn a little bit about what was happening there before the Spaniards arrived, then we learned about Columbus arriving, then we learned about the colonial period, then we learned about Independence War. We went straight into Civil War. We didn't have this delay. And then there's just a chaotic period that ends pretty much in my lifetime. So even as a kid, you know, snow day was coup d'etat day. You know, you'd be like, martial music, no television, yay, no school today. So as you can imagine, we really didn't learn a history of Honduras. What we had was a lot of stories passed down by your abuela or your uncle and then your friends. And I had this conceit that I would create this event, a 24-hour event that was very tongue-in-cheek. It had like posters and radio ads advertising it, saying, come to the Cinematheque. I've hired every typist in this typing academy. And if everyone comes for this period of 24 hours and just dictates whatever memory they have of the history of our country, at the end we'll have like the whole thing. And then there was like a little disclaimer saying, some events might not be remembered by anyone, and some events might be remembered differently by people. So it was a very nice piece. It had a little flow. It's a very humble, Honduras is very poor, so as you can see, even our Cinematheque is really just a video club. People would mill in and out. I provided meals every 6 hours. I provided bus fares, so it wouldn't just be people from the capital, so you could get a round-trip reimbursement if you came from another part of the country. So it's a very small country. You can go to the capital probably from the furthest point in about 6 hours. So it really could draw people from all over the place. And I also had a portrait maker, so there wouldn't be the interference of like cameras, except mine. And to facilitate participation, I made a form. So before you dictated your story, for example, in this form, you have to figure out where between the landing of Columbus in our shores and the day of the performance, your story was roughly situated. The piece owes a lot to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee from South Africa. I was thinking a lot about how do you make people come to terms with their past and be able to deliver that verbally and orally in front of a public. So the dictation was just really a device to create a kind of safety for the viewers. Like, I'm dictating my story, but I can only do that by saying it out loud. And then my words can be heard by someone who just stands there and listens to me telling the story. And the transcripts would go on the wall as the piece progressed. Some people came incredibly prepared. This gentleman came with notes about the story of his village that included geographical information, names of rivers, hills. You know, as we often study history and geography, he took it very seriously. There's a former judge, so she had a lot of interesting stories to tell. To my surprise, the director of the National Archives of Honduras showed up, and Alejandro Var, and he proposed that when I'm done with this project, I send a manuscript and he will store it in the National Archives. And in the end, then the piece reaches its full closure. It was made for this public, it was made by this public, and it will be stored in a place that's only relevant to that public. And it was not really made for you, and in a way, I've never really made any efforts to try to turn this into an artwork that can go anywhere else, because it would make absolutely no sense. So I asked, is this enough viewers, you know? We were busy the whole time. It results in a book, 69 stories, and maybe that's all there is. The other piece I want to compare it to had 19,000 participants. It had thousands of spectators, maybe more spectators than participants, and has a very large secondary audience. It's written in books, there's articles, so it keeps circulating even after it's happened. The piece was called Key to the City, and it was produced by Creative Time in collaboration with the City of New York, and it had two parts. One part was to take the key to the city of New York, which is really just a symbol. It really doesn't open anything. And then we methodically went to 5 sites in each borough and changed the locks of different kinds of public space. So the piece also charts what public space can be. For example, the lock to the baptismal chamber in St. John the Divine was changed so you could open the baptismal chapel. The Brooklyn Museum agreed to change the lock in this door. That's a concealed museum door that you can see what's behind the white wall where the George Washington portrait by Peale stands. There was a P.O. box in the Bronx that then became a P.O. box that is opened by the Key to the City, P.O. Box 126. Most oldest burial ground in New York City, Western Burial Ground. These are actually gates to the city. If you come by foot from New Jersey into New York City, you have to pass these double gates, and the Port Authority changed the lock so it could be opened with a key to the city. And another kind of public space is invisible infrastructure. So you could also turn this lamppost in Bryant Park on and off with the key, because I want to point out that this is also our space. You know, it's a kind of space. There's other things. Gavin Krober and I worked really hard at this, and one of the spaces we really wanted was a tomb, because we were like, that's the ultimate place where we come to rest in the public space of a city. Our body goes to the ground, and we're trying to convince a cemetery that it would be like a mausoleum that you could open and just be the empty space. But they said yes, and then they realized what it was about, and they backed out. The second part of the piece is that the key to the city is a medal, and only the mayor of New York City has the power to bestow someone who is in history, a famous person, someone who's done a great deed, to have the key. And through a long negotiation with the mayor's office, on the day of the opening, the mayor showed up to devolve his power. And he basically said, for 1 month only, any citizen will be able to bestow the key to the city on whomever they want for whatever reason they want. And the piece begins with that speech by the mayor, basically changing this power structure and giving it back to the population. And that's how the exchanges began. The main site of exchange was in Times Square. where we created a small commons and a red carpet, and then there would be a line, and then volunteers would go and approach people waiting in line, just making sure they didn't think they were in the Broadway ticket line, for example. And also trying to make sure that people came in pairs to give the key to each other. Because often people would come and say, I came here to get the key of the city. And we said, you can't get the key to the city, you can receive the key to the city. So the volunteers would pair strangers who would then get to know each other in the 10-minute wait and figure out why they deserve the key to each other, and they would give it to each other. And then they would arrive in this little park. There was a pedestal made of steel that actually led the documents, because this was a real oath-taking kind of transaction. So people would fill out forms where they would say who they were giving the key to, on what date and for what reason. Then they would sign, and then there would be a little ceremony that they would read out loud and give each other the key. And after that, they would get this, and a small blue passport that showed you how to get to the sites, but didn't actually tell you what you would encounter there. Each one of them was a surprise. And then there would be some hugs. There were very, there was a kind of taxonomy of what would happen. There was often these three-way, four-way, five-way exchanges when it was families. There were the strangers, you know, like this policewoman and this woman didn't know each other. They met online. And then there would also be a lot of lovers. So for example, this couple met in Times Square and got engaged in Times Square and then came here on their anniversary to do this. So the piece was used by the public in many ways. And I won't go into it because I only have 10 minutes. I'm already 11 seconds overboard. But the guiding light for this piece and the inspiration was merely Latimer Nucleus, who from 1972 to 1974 made a piece, Touch Sanitation, where she thanked every single sanitation worker in New York City personally for keeping the city clean. It took more than 2 years, and it took intersecting every shift methodically almost every day. And I thought a lot about this piece since I heard about it when I was a student, about how do you make something civic and keep it intimate at the same time? And what are the limits of how much you can scale it without breaking that intimacy? So I ask again, how many participants are enough? Thank you.
I did not prepare a question. I have too many. My whole work process is based on questions, research questions, I see them as. So the title of today's talk is Serving Two Masters, Intimate Details. I decided to talk about this project because Cara is here, and Cara and I go way back, as far back as this project. In 2012, I think it started. And I wanted to acknowledge the project and her work on it. I was recently invited to a talk in Manchester, England, and they sent me a series of questions. And the questions, one of them was, what's so great about social practice? And the other is, of course, the old question, is change the measure of this work? And what do we mean by change, and how do we measure it? The next question was, are there drawbacks about working in this way? And having just gotten back Friday night from Ecuador, I could say profoundly yes. It's exhausting, it's detail-oriented. But the other question I found really interesting was the question of, is kindness a part of this practice? And at first I thought, well, you know, who cares about that? It's sort of such a trite question. And then as I've thought more and more about it, I've come back to the issue of kindness. I'd say the reason I call this Serving Two Masters is there really, I began every project with a research question, and the question has to do both with the social sphere, or the public, that Paul was talking about, and also the aesthetic sphere, because I came out of an era like Merle, where transformation of process became the subject matter of the work, and thus we worked and invented performance art, and ultimately dematerialized sculpture, and finally social practice. So let me answer the first question briefly. What is so great about social practice? Actually, I'm not sure anything is great about it from an aesthetic sensibility. It's simply another art form, neither better nor worse than, for example, painting. And I think there's much competition and misunderstanding in the art world as a result of that question. But I think that is change a measure of this work is much more complicated and a whole lot more interesting. So I guess if I had any question at all, it would be, what do we mean by change? And is it art or is it politics? And that question continues for me to keep me interested and motivated in this kind of work. I'd say that basically the work is the way it is because, and this is the beginning of our project together between the door and the street at the Brooklyn Museum, and I should say Creative Time is the co-sponsor with the Brooklyn Museum, Elizabeth Sackler Center of this project. That's where I met Cara. But because my training is in community organizing on the one hand and performance on the other, I put those two things together and make my form of art. Paul does, Jon does, we all work slightly differently. And therefore, I think this field is extremely engaging because it's really a series of questions. It's really a much more intellectual pursuit than most people outside the practice imagine. In this particular project, it exemplifies a political strategy of seeking convergence. I think protest is on the rise now, and anger is definitely an issue that infuses our social sphere and our political sphere. Most of us who are working in social practice think about these issues. How is the public constructed? What are the narratives that inform social life? After doing protest work in the 70s, I became much more interested, probably a product of my era, in the notion of forming alliances and consensus. So this project is really about looking at differences, feminist history from the 70s, for example, and today's young women activists, looking at differences, convergences, and basically all framed within the notion that if we talk together, we can overcome some of the differences and find common cause. Now, common cause is a very difficult thing to find, and hopefully in the panel we'll talk about it a bit, about the political culture that all of us operate in. In particular in this project, I wanted to support the work of younger activists. It was a metaphoric coalition, which only lasted for a few brief months, meant to bring attention to the breadth of issues that might be considered activists in terms of how what is now called gender justice is currently defined by those people. So my own private title for this was Looking for Feminism. And of course, looking for feminism has a lot to do with today, has a lot to do with some of the mistakes of race, ethnicity, and class that were part of the original feminist movement. However, the sorts of things I look at is how is feminism conveyed historically from my era to yours? And what is it you really know about that era? How many people of that era were indeed dealing with issues of class and race that wouldn't get broadcast or transmitted? And then my question would be, why is that transmission the way it is? To what public end? So basically part of this research was to determine what new concepts linked to activism, what could I learn, and feminism, and identify those contested fault lines, and to query where the intersections were productive and where prejudices and misconceptions prevented alliances and needed conversation. So I'm going to show you now basically how this piece was constructed, some of the details of the work, and then I'll show you a 3-minute video. First, I suggested to Creative Time that there's no way we can do this project without a coalition, a greatly diverse coalition of activist women in the city and 1 or 2 men who would basically bring forward the issues that they felt were the most important. So we identified about 100 women, like Ai-jen Poo, who's done a lot of work on class, immigration, and the service economy, global service economy. And we put those women together and began asking them questions, and they informed us of their conversations. We took lengthy notes, fed the questions back to each other, and this advisory committee made up of 20, I think 1 or 2 people, really represented a mass diversity of people in New York, concerned with social justice issues. I wouldn't even allow us to develop a title without those women weighing in. And I think that's something that is an intimate detail that's very important to notice in this kind of work, that if you want to deal, for example, with the issue of diversity, you have to start with opinions by women or people who represent that diversity. You have to start the project there. And then the second major aspect of this work was community organizing. And if you look on the left, the Chinese woman, Jennifer Su, was she's an artist herself, a filmmaker, but an amazing crackerjack organizer. And we worked with her. We hired 10, we called them, what did we call them, Cara? We called them the Gang of 10, I think. The Gang of 10, and I insisted the Gang of 10 was not just diverse, but more diverse than the staff of Creative Time. I kept pointing out, you know, there's a lot of white people here. We must have more women of color. These were young women. We didn't pay them a lot. We did pay them a stipend, and we taught them how to community organize. They went out subsequently, and they worked with, I think it's 100, and it probably says up there, 180 organizations in New York, because we felt that in order to provide support for the people, mostly women, who would be part of our project, it was important to create a support network. They would come out of an organization, and then after the performance, they would go back to the organization, so that any kind of traumatic issues, any kind of political issues, anything that might result from the exposure of themselves and their political issues could be addressed through a support network. So in these organizations, there was one woman that would volunteer, or one person would volunteer to lead the assembly of a group of anywhere from 4 to 8 people, except in the case of Young Kyung Chung, a good friend of mine who's a theologian from Columbia. She, I think, organized 25 young Korean women. These organizations, the other thing the Gang of 8, I guess it was the Gang of 8 plus 2. The other thing that these guys did was we sat down and we looked at the demographics of New York very carefully. Now, this is a strategy that in the world of art is considered probably highly socially inappropriate. For community organizers, it's a very important guideline to you for how you need to guarantee at least that much participation, at least the participation that matches the demography of the area. So we created items that matched carefully demographic figures for all of New York, but we also had what I called issues of the heart. For example, I've worked a lot with women prisoners, and I'm very connected to those issues and that culture. So I said, they probably don't represent a huge democracy, but that's my passion vote. I want to put them up. Now, the other community we had to organize, it became apparent after a while, was the block upon which these people would express their political positions. And after looking around Brooklyn and getting lots of feedback about the different meanings of different neighborhoods, we chose a diverse neighborhood close to the museum that had certain visual qualities. But as soon as we realized we were going to want to use their stoops as a performance site, because in New York, sitting on stoops is a very big part of the culture in the summer, we knew that we would be blocking off their street and so on, so we needed the involvement of people in the community. In this case, I believe it was 62 stoops. I think we didn't get 2 or 3. So that also was very important in terms of a detail, was to get every single stoop. And that's one side of the street, the diagram, and the streets and the addresses located. And Cara, much to my dismay, insisted that we cover all of this in terms of liability, which I wanted to go around. Now, we were very lucky, and much to, I think, Creative Times' consternation, but willingness, I said, this is going to be an educational process. Every time I turned around, we needed to get another organizer. In this case, the woman on the left from Palestine is our organizer of the block, an amazing woman, and these are a couple of the people on the block. We lucked out. We picked an extremely progressive block, including people like the guy on the right, who happened to be a lighting designer and got, so, you know, as they had talents or abilities, we pulled them together to work in various ways on the production. I basically moved into the block and began living there and working. It was great, great organizing. And as we progressed, this became the size and the shape of the various units of the project. So finally now, getting to the day of the performance, we blocked off the street early in the morning and moved all the cars and had to tow a couple. And we brought volunteers. Creative Time is amazing at organizing volunteers, and they organize massive volunteers. You never know on this kind of project until the day of the event how many people are going to be part of it. And so you have to create a lot of contingency plans. This is Sylvia Mantequilla Ortiz, who is one of our students that graduated from Otis on the left, and she organized people from Tanya Bruguera's Immigration Nation, young women. And so these are the performers as they start showing up. Those yellow scarves were one of the few concessions we could make to visuality for the project, which is very important to me. And I think, Cara, your idea of the chrysanthemums, I believe it was, wasn't it? Or was it the scarves? Cara was very helpful in thinking through the visual aesthetics. So this is production, and these two people are producers, and this is Arnold's sort of job description. And I realized finally what happens when the visual arts culture comes into problems with the stage, theater, film culture. They're very, very different, and this is the thing that producers for film understand extremely well, which is walkie-talkie communications and chain of authority and command. This is the script for the day, every single minute being accounted for. And finally, the performers were ready to enter the space. This was a highly organized event for 360 women performers on 60 different stoops. They came in, no audience here. Every single, you see the chrysanthemums and the scarves, and every single porch is very carefully negotiated. There's a group leader sitting within the group, and there's a person stationed right outside to protect the group. The neighbors, that's the neighbors being interviewed, and now the audience arrives. I think around 2,000 people, and you have to be very careful how you allow them in so you don't intimidate the performers. True to Brooklyn and New York, it was a highly diverse audience along with a highly diverse group of so-called performers. And the yellow line, my own special addition to the performance, and you can see how it begins to create a little bit of visual coherence. And the women were talking about various things, from aging to breast milk to restaurant opportunity center, occupational center was there, domestic violence groups were there, people who were working with prisoners and ex-prisoners. There were men in this performance, including and trans as well, talking about various issues. Disabled women, this is a group from the block who got involved. And you can see the audience beginning to arise. What's, I think, important, we had one issue about children and what to do with children, and I left that up to the performers, strongly urging them to keep their children at home for this reason. But as you can see, many of them didn't, and it is an important political issue to wrestle with, is childcare. The audience was free to wander at will, to talk to each other, but there was a lot of this, a lot of really deep focus, and this is how the audience becomes performers. They are engaged with the so-called performers. They too are performers. They're performing the act of constructing their own narrative from issue to issue to issue, and attending deeply to the words, experience, and politics of women. At the end of the project, we invited the community to set up these tables and provide food for the audience and the performers, who then came down from the steps, except for this group from Turkey, who wanted to read their own performance. It was letters from women who had lost their children in the recent activities and sit-ins in Turkey. So what I'd like to do is play really quickly the video, if we can, of the performance. It's 3 minutes.
Before the orientation starts. Okay. And then we'll give you a start.
We're re-strategizing. Can you guys gather over here for a minute? We're going to talk about sweeping delay tape.
And then we're going to slowly be kind of coming out, tablecloth, and then they're going to peel off to the right, walk all the way back.
I think they're doing something with women and poverty. That's what I believe. Yeah, feminism.
About this project is how many of you have come together to construct it. This is a symbolic gesture. Whatever you feel, whatever you want to say, that is completely up to you.
It was very like, he was like, still like very tough love, but very gentle with me, and like, oh, because you're a girl, you can cry. And that's okay, but now that I'm like, no daddy, I'm queer, and I embrace both genders. It's like very like, oh, you don't need to cry, like suck that up, you know. Very like, it's more like
generations all my life. I've been accustomed to hearing men say hi gorgeous, and I say hi. I just know they're talking to me. Yes. He said hi gorgeous. Right, my goddaughter said hi. I'm like, what? I'm middle-aged now.
This is what you see on the news after there's a domestic violence homicide all the time. I had no idea. He seems so nice. It's because their issue is not anger management. It's power, it's control, it's coercion.
Sometimes I feel like asking my mom some things that I don't know. But maybe I cannot ask her because she don't know nothing about it. She didn't go to school.
Not a piece of me. I'm like, talk to me like I'm your daughter or your sister or your mother. Don't talk to me like I'm your next meal.
What is something you want for your daughter's education? It could be the same.
I wanted to assimilate so much and I wanted to blend in so bad.
The background of the victim isn't taken into account because then you're not tough on crime.
Your body doesn't feel young, but your soul feels young. Your spirit.
Oh, yeah.
How do we bring to light the feminization of poverty?
You know, it's not every day that we shut down our city blocks for things other than tube socks and Italian sausages. So to do something that really has a profound transformation of our individual lives and our collective lives, I think is very exciting for people.
What you see here is the result of extensive relationships that at its fruition are these 400 people having a conversation. And so in many ways, the project's in some ways already finished by the time that the people come to see it.
One more slide here. Maybe during the conversation I can talk a little bit about the same kinds of issues involved with this project in Ecuador right now.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jon Rubin, and thanks for having me here. I'm super excited. Suzanne was my teacher and mentor, so the work you're seeing actually is a byproduct of much of what I learned from studying with her 25 years ago. Okay, I let the cat out of the bag right there. Let me see if I can, oops. So the question I'm asking is, what's the value of staying home? What's the value of a long-term project over a short-term project? So I'm not going to show a short-term project. Instead, what I'm going to show are two projects, one that led into another over the course of 7 years. And what happens when you stick with something, how relationships start to accrue, how it gathers moss, how density naturally occurs, when a cockamamie scheme becomes a long-term initiative. And how, in essence, as an artist who works in the public sphere, the public, with me and all of the collaborators, become co-authors. And we're constantly rearranging and constructing the work in an iterative process. So I'm going to talk about two projects. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I teach at Carnegie Mellon in the School of Art. So the first thing I started doing when I came to Pittsburgh is I started teaching my classes in empty storefronts, because there's plenty of them, as a way of knowing the city and as a way of getting the students directly into the public. And one of the first things that happened was I taught a class, and this is actually a couple years in, ended up being a project called the Waffle Shop. And the way the Waffle Shop worked was we looked at a very, very local situation. We found a storefront in a working class African-American neighborhood that had an incredibly active hip-hop club right next to the store. And you know, hip-hop's that one or two things that bring people together between class and race. And it was this spot in the city that was incredibly dynamic. It was already functioning really well. And the idea was, how could we sort of work with that dynamic? So what we did was I talked to the owner, and I had the students come in, and he said, listen, I serve waffles in the middle of the night to keep my patrons here. I have one waffle iron, and it's broken. You can have it for your strange art project. And in the middle of the night, while everyone's drunk and there's nowhere to eat in Pittsburgh, I bet you could coax folks in. And so we did. So we opened from 11 a.m. till 3 in the morning. And what happened was, by serving waffles, we brought in an incredibly strange and constantly changing group of folks. In the middle of the night was one type of audience, and in the end we opened for brunch. We kept the project going for 4 years. So it started as a class and then developed into an artwork. And anyone who walked in was automatically asked to be on a live talk show. And the talk show was streamed over the internet. Little 2-channel, right on our own channel there. Little website, you could actually be a guest on the show from anywhere in the world. But really what was most important was this hyper-local situation, right? This dynamic where how do you create spaces in public life where people who don't come into a situation together, and Suzanne, I think, is perhaps one of the best people at doing this, would feel comfortable engaging with each other. What structures are there for artists to use? And for me, I'm really interested in vernacular structures, structures that are sort of part of our common popular language of culture. And one of them is a restaurant. We all know how to behave in a restaurant. And these two groups could come into the restaurant, no problem. Now, but do they engage with each other? So the other is the talk show. So in the back of the restaurant is a talk show set. And although we've never been on a talk show, we all kind of know how to behave on it miraculously. And people fall very easily into presenting a kind of public persona of themselves, and a very playful, it's a space, right? It's a fictional space. It's this stage here that I'm speaking to you on, but with barely a fourth wall. So everyone's invited to come up, and what happened was basically these incredibly strange mixes of folks would be speaking with each other. This kid from our neighborhood had a show on basketball and Islam, and this Jewish woman from the local Squirrel Hill neighborhood came in on her birthday with her girlfriends, had no idea there was a talk show in this strange restaurant, and she and all of her girlfriends get up there, and they're for hours. Okay? They wouldn't leave the stage. And that to me, you know, there's no great TV moments being produced by this. There's just an aggregate social experience of people coming together in combinations that are rare in public life. And after 4 years and over 10,000 people actually being on stage, what happened was the project basically got taken over by community members who were thinking, you know, this is sort of somewhere between public access TV and dinner theater and making up a play in your backyard. And that kind of open-ended vernacular playfulness that anyone could approach and enter created a really strange kind of, I think, of social documentary. That at any given moment, the people who were there were the content producers. The people who were there, this is, okay, I'll keep going, there's not much time. The people who were there were also the funders. It's very important to note that the project was funded by food sales. And the people that there were also the audience members. So any one person walking in played every single role in this work. And I'm only using this as a preamble to the next project. So I ran this for about 4 years. I'm going to play a tiny... Can you play this clip real quick?
I was the lion in The Wizard of Oz.
In jail.
In prison. Like, yeah, I don't do anything goes. I can do some stuff. I can be the lion from The Wizard of Oz in prison.
Well, the first time I saw a light switch turn on,
You just thought it was like daytime all of a sudden.
I was like, yeah, I was like, what madness is this? That's when I used to talk like that. I don't talk like that much anymore. But
Right.
what madness ye lore hath brought before thine eyes. And then I just smash it into bits.
But this has been like the most ridiculous thing. I mean, like I saw Inception last week, and this is weirder.
Really? Oh,
Yeah.
oh, wow.
Like I feel like I'm in an Inception right now.
You know what? I have to say
Ellen
that.
Page built this world for me.
I can't believe this exists, to be honest.
Yeah, many people can't believe that it exists. It's odd though that you can't believe that it exists and you're actually physically here.
This was on our bucket list.
Yes.
Yeah, because we've always drove past this waffle
Yeah.
place and we're like, what is this waffle shop and why is it only open in the middle of the night? So.
It's very cool. Christine and I don't know each other at all.
We met this morning.
Just this morning,
Yeah.
over waffles and coffee. But now this is amazing.
It's definitely a nerd tree.
Someone to understand you like I.
There's a it goes on and on and on. So after 4 years of running that project, an artist and former student of mine, Don Waleski, and I came up with another initiative that basically ran out of the same kitchen we were running the waffle shop from. And it was called Conflict Kitchen, and it's now in its 5th year. And Conflict Kitchen responds both to a very local dynamic and to a global one. And so Conflict Kitchen serves food from countries the United States is in conflict with on a rotating basis. And the reason that the project developed was very specific to the condition of a small post-industrial city of Pittsburgh, one where, you know, we actually have an Afghan community, we have an Iranian community, we have a Palestinian community, but they're not part of the public identity of the city. And then sort of the national issue of it is that, you know, do we have a place in public life, on the street, on a daily basis, where we can confront narratives that are uncomfortable to us, where we can understand cultures that might be presented in very simplified and polarized manner through the media, where we can confront basically our own community that is often invisible. So the way the project works is oftentimes we'll travel. This is in Cuba, cooking with people in their homes. This is working with North Korean defectors, talking about the recipes, talking about how food leads to culture, leads to politics, leads to everything, really. Interviewing folks and bringing that information back to our city. So the food is sold and wrapped with material that when you unfold it has interviews with folks from that country. And breaking down in many ways the actual complexity of perspectives. We're really in the business not of simplifying. We really want to make your notion of how folks in Iran think of themselves and the world around them much more complicated. And so we've become a bit of a publishing joint. Interviews with Cuban kids and Palestinians, and we oftentimes buy our material. This is actually from a farmer in the West Bank whose form of resistance is just continuing to farm while the settlements surround him. So the talk show format is taken to the street, right? Now the engagement happens on a daily level between our staff and our customers. Again, this is a project that's fully funded by food sales. 95% of what keeps the operation alive 7 days a week for the past 5 years has been folks coming to the door and buying the food. So we've now moved to the largest public plaza in Pittsburgh, where we get between 300 to 400 people on a nice summer day. And the project, again, by staying in the same place, has started to build, both economically, both through relationships. You know, our Venezuelan community, who we worked with, come to support the Palestinian community when we open their events. The Iranian community supports the Afghan community. These are a whole bunch of events that we do, live Skype meal between Pittsburgh and Tehran. This is in Tehran and Pittsburgh. This is a speech that we asked folks in Cuba to write for Barack Obama. Then we hired the #1 Barack Obama impersonator to deliver the speech. We now have a full education and outreach director creating curriculum and doing workshops with schools from K through college. We do performances. This is one where you can have lunch directly with someone in Iran through the body of one of our staff members. So she basically functions as a live human avatar, talking directly on behalf of the person who is speaking in their ear from Iran. And in a sense, this becomes a metaphor for the project. Here, Tracy on the right is speaking for Mohammed, who's in Palestine. I mean, she's an African-American woman in Pittsburgh speaking for an Arab man in East Jerusalem. And the confusion of identity to us is actually a powerful tool. Weekly meetings. We recently went to Palestine and came back and opened a version of the project and received a lot of criticism from the local Jewish Federation, who made very heinous claims against us in order to shut us down. A lot of pressure on all of our supporters. Newspapers. It basically led to this, where the Secretary of State was associated with our project in a very specious way because we received a grant from his wife's foundation, and the B'nai B'rith calling for them to disavow the grant, which the grant agency actually did. The Heinz Endowments disavowed their grant to us because we focused on Palestine. Apparently North Korea, it's fine. We received a death threat, unfortunately, a week later and had to close the restaurant, but that really galvanized the support that we had built over 5 years in the city, something that I don't think we could have withstood if we hadn't been there every single day in people's lives and they hadn't felt a sense of kinship with the mission of the work and, frankly, an interest in the voice of Palestinians in their city. So the future of Conflict Kitchen, we're actually focusing on America's conflict with Black America, and we did a recent event on Juneteenth, and local indigenous nations as well. So I'm going to just play this for a second and then be done. If you could play the video first. So one of the interesting byproducts of this hyper-local project is it's actually also had a resonance outside of our city.
Die USA sind in viele Konflikte verwickelt, ob militärisch wie noch bis vor kurzem in Irak, als Schutzmacht für Israel im Nahen Osten oder ideologisch verfeindet, wie etwa mit Nordkorea, Venezuela oder Kuba. Diese Länder kennen viele Amerikaner nur als Bösewichte aus den Fernsehnachrichten. Das Takeaway-Restaurant Conflict Kitchen setzt da den Kochlöffel an und serviert wechselnde Menüs aus genau solchen Ländern.
التجربة هو خلق جو موات لمناقشة ثقافات الشعوب والسياسة الخارجية الأمريكية.
L'idea è di attirare i clienti con del buon cibo per poi coinvolgere in eventi o dibattiti mirati a stimolare proprio la conoscenza della cultura e della politica di alcuni stati come per esempio l'Iran, l'Iraq, Cuba, Venezuela e la Corea del Nord.
ويبدو أن فكرة المطعم تجاوزت ذلك بتوظيفها الطعام لإضفاء مسحة إنسانية على الحروب والنزاعات.
So you order Iranian food or Persian food, anywhere from $5 to $8, and they give it to you wrapped up in a wrapper that has conversations from people that are in that country.
It features the opinions of Palestinians living on the West Bank and in the United States.
Wenn seine Köstlichkeiten auspackt, dann erfährt man etwas über Afghanistan, zum Beispiel, was ist die aktuelle Regierung oder was sind die Rechte der Frauen. Eine Art kulinarische Völkerverständigung.
I think what they do is fantastic. They inform people about issues that are otherwise unknown in the United States.
Viele Leute denken, wir Afghanen sind Terroristen, vor allem nach den Anschlägen des 11. September. Aber unser Land entwickelt sich weiter und das ist toll, dass man das hier lernt.
The video is online and other stuff's online. Thank you very much.
Hello? Cara, can you hear me?
Okay. Wow. Thank you. I have to say that was what a brilliant set of artists we have on the stage, and I'm very honored to be with everyone. One of my first questions is it's one of the things I got from watching everyone is I understand you're creating these frameworks, you're creating structures, and that the public becomes an active agent as part of it. And I'm wondering how you deal with that voice, and at what point do you let them come in and really shape and influence your project? These were all presented as final projects, but in fact, they enter at various moments and really do presumably shift the course for you. And how do you plan for that, and then how do you let it unfold? Yeah, a big question.
Okay, so one thing I think a lot about is the back end of a project. And for example, the two projects I chose are interesting because the Key to the City had more people making it than Dictar and Recordar had people participating in it. And I often think that we tend to think in this really final way, which is, for example, impossible to think in your projects because they're ongoing. And once you lift the cover and let us see underneath, you see in your project, which is that to make something in public space with the public, there's the people making it with you, and that's actually a sizable number of people, and they are being affected by the making of the project. And I often think it's not this linear thing where like the most important people are the people at the end. It's also the people in the making of it. Like I think there's a project Thomas Hirschhorn did called the Musée Précaire, where he convinced the Pompidou Center to lend works to a precarious museum that was made by a North African community in a park in the outskirts of Paris. And that's what I saw as a member of the public. But what I keep thinking is, how did this project affect the Pompidou? Like, what happened that I can't see behind closed doors to convince these custodians of the French treasures that it would be okay to have North African teenagers trained as art handlers, put in a truck and move it out to the outskirts of Paris? That's also something the artwork is doing, not just what it's doing at what we see as the end product of it. I don't know if this addresses what you're saying. And the numbers can shift. Like, I could try to imagine a project that's made for one person, but made by 1,000 people, and that would be really an interesting art project.
Yeah, I mean, again, maybe since I haven't sat next to Suzanne in many, many years, but one of the things I remember learning from her is, you know, there's the tip of the iceberg that you see, and then there's, you know, the depth of what's underwater. And oftentimes in the art world, we're trained to kind of think of that tip as the totality of the work. And these are works that, you know, have resonance and bases that basically continue to grow during the process of the work, after the work, and you can see that as material. You can create mechanisms to foster those relationships and have them grow. You also can recognize as an artist who works in this way that much of that will be invisible to the public. And you know, I think if you look at all the works, we're fairly performative. We have these really clear entry points. You know, the public can tell the story of what we're doing, and they can retell it and mythologize it. But there's also what kind of underpins all of that, and that's like a kind of vast rhizome, you know, that in many ways is out of your control. That's the fun. To me, the greatest part of working in the public is working with so many elements that, you know, I am just watching occur and theoretically creating a platform for, as opposed to, like, you know, fully authoring and constructing on my own.
I think it goes to my question about serving two masters. For me, I'm quite fascinated with the detail of the construction of these works, because they look like, I remember at NATO when he says in that piece, the piece took place before. Well, I don't think that's true. I actually think that the piece was taking place at that moment as well. But I think that the details of this kind of construction evidence a variety of things which have to do with ethics, have to do with personality, have to do with training, but also have to do with aesthetics. And so for me, what's interesting is trying to deconstruct which is which. Now, obviously, we're never going to get there. It's never going to be a political action or a performative action, an aesthetic action. But just asking the question keeps me engaged in the process. I mean, otherwise I'd go off and be a politician if I wanted to just be an activist, or I'd paint. You know, painting's actually quite a bit more remunerative, I'd like to tell you guys. So the idea of constantly staying on the edge, which is really where conceptual art started, on the edge of what is life and what is not life, as my mentor Capro used to say, is, I think, the salient question. And when you're a political person, then life is going to involve politics. So narrating through when a critique, like one I'm facing right now in Ecuador, is I'm doing a project on men and violence, and we want 600 men to read letters written by women on the experience of violence. That's kind of getting conflicted down there. Why are we doing it in a bull ring? Why are we having, where's the voice of women? Why are we having men? Those questions evidence, and the answers to them evidence me and my colleagues' political positions, but I'm always in there also aesthetically as an artist.
Going back to your question, Paul, how quickly does everyone think about scale? Or do you think about other factors of quality of experience when you're in that planning process? That was certainly a very valid question as to the scale of participation and its after effects.
Should we stick to the order? I mean, I think a lot about that in the sense that I feel like there's that moment of the encounter between Jorge Luis Borges said that art is not the poem, but is the moment when someone grabs the book in the library, the poetry book, and they like take, and that's when the art happens. So, for example, in my studio, we do a lot of play acting because we're like, it's like working at a fast food restaurant in the sense where you're like, I need to figure out this moment of encounter so it seems seamless and natural, and the mode of operation of the participant feels like they're not trying to figure it out. It's just sort of one thing leads to the other, and you have to rehearse it over and over. You're like, oh wow, now there's 1 minute where the person's like, I'm just waiting for you to do something, and that's it. The artwork is broken. The person's like, text a girlfriend, whatever. And so it's about crafting I see that participation is weird because in some ways, and I see it in all of our work, it's very crafted, it's very constrained, and people, like I don't say, just go on stage and say anything. It's like, go on stage in this place, look at this form, speak in this way, and then you can say anything. But I find that that actually is a generous thing. That is the way that I'm a relatively shy person. It's like, I can't participate unless I understand where my area of self-expression can happen. Like I need the permission to express myself.
I think it's the aesthetic crafting. I think that the visuals that you have, and then the kind of quality of the interaction of the talk show and the crappy video, and all of that's very thoughtful. It doesn't just happen. Women don't just sit on a stoop and all of a sudden start talking about these particular issues. The work, I think Creative Time was a little shocked when I insisted on putting a yellow stripe down both sides. They were kind of like, why are you doing this? It's about a conversation. And for me, every element, every detail is part of the aesthetics of the work. I think scale is interesting for two perspectives. I got into it partially because of politics and media. I've been looking at media most of my career. I'm very interested in analyzing the difference between Sean Hannity and Rachel Maddow and how reality is constructed for all of us around different issues. But so scale is something, and repetition is something that operates very strongly in our culture, our popular culture. So if you have an interest in politics, then you're naturally going to gravitate toward that. But I also love the visual of scale. I love Russian constructivism and the storming of the Winter Palace and, tanks that the Russian government gave to all the artists for a brief 3 years. So I think it's both, which doesn't say that intimacy in small works, for me, aesthetically, they're no different. They're just interesting ways to work.
Yeah, there's also an issue, maybe to get to the question that I brought up of working at home and working long term. I do have an issue of scale, and it's often dictated by either the amount of time I can spend in a place or the budget. I mean, let's call it what it is. The amount of money that you have as a resource to produce a work often will dictate how ambitious and how long term and how in depth it can be. And I'm very fortunate in that the Conflict Kitchen, basically I don't have that concern. It's a business as well. I mean, I have other concerns, but and it has allowed a kind of flexibility that I've never had in creating public works, that I have to limit even my ambition, and I'm currently dealing with that. There's a project that I really would like to, it needs to play out over a year. But the agencies that are involved with it would like it to play out over 6 weeks. And I'm sort of like, well, don't you see these two don't collide? And
okay, so that's something we should all get into if you want to get into the dirt, which is that when we self-initiated, like you did with Conflict Kitchen, or I did with the Oakland projects, you can go on as long as you want to and you get some resources to keep everybody engaged. But I'm finding more and more that institutions, as they take up social practice, are constraining us, one with budget, but frankly the budgets aren't bad for these kinds of projects. But what really gets constrained is the timeline. I told Creative Time when I went into the projects, I said there's 3 variables: scale, money, and time. If one of them goes down, something's going to get affected. So you basically have to think through, how big do you want it to be, how long do you have to give to it, and how much money is needed. And the money for, I think, most of these projects goes to paying people. Not us. We all teach, all of us, to make a living. Our money goes into paying people that work on projects, I would guess. Mm-hmm. So that's something to get into.
Thank you. Somehow, despite our best efforts at keeping on to time, we have gone a little bit longer. So I just want to plant the seed that when you are, Oh, okay. We started a little bit late. Oh, thank you. But I do want to plant the seed that if you have burning questions, I'll come around shortly to allow everyone. But so prep for your questions. But one of the things I wanted to add to what you were saying, Jon, when you're thinking about the duration and the questions you were putting forward, you also then have to deal with what happens to the project beyond its performance or at the conclusion, or you have a lot of people invested in these things, not just those who are performing at that moment, but the people working in the restaurant, the people funding it, and people are invested in these projects, especially once you start participating. I certainly watched it with Between the Door and the Street. And how do you create frameworks, or do you create frameworks for it to last beyond without you? How do you begin to think about that issue? Yeah, go ahead.
I've thought about it a lot over the years and written about it a lot. And I finally actually come to the conclusion that you can only do as much as you have the capacity to do based on your resources. So, you know, the World Wildlife Fund has a nonprofit. It has great resources, and it can create a continuity that's very difficult for an individual artist to do. I think the best you can do is find strategic points of entry, like the project I'm doing in Ecuador. I've made friends with the medical school at UDLA, and they are incorporating the workshops that we started into their medical school curriculum, so every student will receive that. But I think we'll receive a consciousness raising or an information data on the public health issues of violence against women. But I think it's a trope that we've fallen into. There are a lot of false tropes for the measurements of our work that I don't think they're, I don't think they really address the heart of the practice. Like with our project, the creative time could have, and we talked about them raising the money to create a website that would exchange data from all the organizations, and that was limited, but it was some form of continuity. And they weren't able to do it, and I was pretty clear that living in LA, you know, and teaching, I wasn't going to be able to do it. So I think it's a false expectation to say to artists who, you know, aren't making a lot of money ultimately and working our butts off, you know, to say to them, you are responsible for maintaining the same thing that a social that a social institution would maintain, you know, would do over time. I mean, look at Sylvester Stallone movies. I mean, please, if I have those resources, I could do a lot, right?
I just saw the preview for the next Rocky movie yesterday.
It's like his son, right?
It's his protege, yeah.
Oh no, it's Apollo Creed's son.
It's Apollo Creed's son, that's right. And the thing about your question is that it's about duration, and I feel that I think we're always in a danger of underestimating the public. The public lives in the world and moves to the public sphere, and people understand very well what the right duration is for a cultural or social experience. And it's just about always meeting or exceeding that expectation or defying that expectation. I was in a panel about duration recently, and they were talking about these two events, and I brought a third event. One was that at the Armory in New York, there was the French artist, I forget his name. No, another one. But he flooded the entire Armory really slowly until it was a reflecting pool and there was a piano piece. And then people were impatient because they came to a visual arts event. And a visual arts event promises that the work of art will be available at all times while the venue is open for you to see individually. We don't like it when we go to museums and the video is going to play at 3 and you got there at 10. You're like, there's a social contract here. I came to look at the art on my time, not your time. But I went to see a piece that is basically predates that, which is a piece by Pina Bausch, where the stage floods really slowly, and it's like a 3-hour piece. But I'm in the theater, so I know that I'm going to sit still for 3 hours and watch this, and I'm delighted, because that's the social contract I have with the theater. I come in its time, and it takes a long time, and I have to be patient. I have to sit still. But then there was a flood in New Orleans, and a hurricane flooded the entire city, and an artist went and worked really hard for a year to make one piece. But the community sees that as they just came here, they did something, and they left. Because in the life of a city, a year is nothing. So I think it's a relative question, is the duration relative to what? And yeah, that's my complicated answer.
I mean, I've been thinking, my works have, not all of them, but moving to be sort of quasi-institutions as artworks, right? And so, in essence, that contract that is traditional to an art audience is broken and confused, and you can enter the work not even knowing you're entering an art experience whatsoever. You could exit it not knowing you had an art experience, or you could recognize the following week that it is an art experience. And I'm also really compelled by how works, when you work in that way, number one, when you're an institution as an artwork, people see you in a different way. Other institutions see you in other ways. I mean, we're just like a mom and pop shop, right? We're just the local business. And in that, I think you accrue a kind of perception in the public that that is basically integrated into the way in which they see everything else in their life. They don't set you apart. And I think there's something potentially powerful in that. Now, of course, the challenge of that is to be clear, right? It's not to fall into the fabric of society, to be clear on what your identity and mission is. But I think if you can balance between, not being so esoteric and not being so banal, you actually enter people's daily lives in ways that are so much more organic than most art, does, and then their relationship to it and its impact on them will just happen over time. And you can't, the measuring shit, that is sort of imposed upon a lot of public art agencies, right, and a lot of this placemaking and all this stuff of, expecting art to be instrumentalized towards all these sort of bottom line capitalist ends, just starts to fall away. And I not always, but that would be a hope.
It's another one of those tropes, that we got ourselves into this. I remember years ago I used to talk about the way in which artists didn't really commit to a project over time. And then suddenly, and I think that's a very nuanced question, how long you're going to spend. It's not knee-jerk, if the longer it is, the better, the more people, the better. But I discovered that basically over time, the community was starting to, the art community, if you want to call it a community, was starting to critique me based on my own questions. And they developed the parachute phenomenon. You guys haven't been around quite long enough to see that, but wait, your commentary will become used against you because I think there's so little known about this practice ultimately and the details of it.
And I think, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, sorry, no, I was going to say, the thing, interesting to think also, because there's a lot of talk about conservation, it's like I spent a lot of time looking at monuments. So one exercise I did is once I went to look at the USS Maine Memorial in Central Park all day long. And it's like, well, a lot of money and energy and engineering and thought was spent in creating something that its duration would be forever. But no one knows what this monument is about. They have found new uses for it. So it's again like you could be criticized for not spending enough time, but say you could spend all the time in the world, beyond your lifetime even, would that really be success? I saw the monument was being used for people as I'll meet you here. There are people having lunch on it. There are people like stretching before they ran. It has a list of all the dead sailors. Like it's a monument to this death of these sailors, and it's like, whoosh, right? So lasting forever doesn't necessarily meet the goal.
That's a question I have, and I've always had is, when do you make a decision to become a nonprofit? And when do you stay an artwork, and is there a relationship with that?
Non-profitable or non-profit?
Well, we're always non-profitable, but I mean, when do you become an institution? And I think that's in a way a kind of a characteristic. Like I would go crazy if I had to do another institution other than academics, right? It's enough already. But, basically, when do you make that decision? Like Redessa Jones, if you guys know her, in San Francisco, was Bill T. Jones's sister, began working in jails and prisons, and she became a nonprofit. And, how are you suited to that, and is it still art at that point?
I mean, that's the Alan Capro question, right? Is when does it just become life, and when does it become art? And is that, even important to have to draw that distinction. Something maybe naturally becomes something else and nothing is lost in the transition.
I think one of the lines along that too is that it shifts the perception of the piece and how it might be written about, what fields it gets categorized in when you make that shift from artist to nonprofit.
That's really, and that to me is really interesting because, listen, I mean, I think all of our work has been written with a bit in art, but a lot outside of art, you know, and there's portals or entry points into the works that aren't exclusive. They don't need a vocabulary that, you know, only a subset of the population has. And if it's public art, it should be part of, you know, multiple discourses and have multiple entry points. And I think even short projects can, you know, I mean, I don't want to make this a contest between short and long projects, but I mean, I think any artwork that's really, you know, working publicly isn't just in the public for a kind of art aficionado audience.
Mm-hmm.
I think Rick Lowe is the grandpa of, maybe Judy Baca, of long-term institutional work. She's still working on the Great Wall, and Rick is still obviously working on Project Row Houses. And I think we accept that and as practitioners, and we think about what it means. And that's the thing I'd love to leave people with. This isn't a simple practice. It's a very thoughtful practice, and each one of us, like, I can appreciate the key project, even though I might not do something like that, because I understand his methods, his motivations, the complexity, and the politics underneath it.
I'm going to do a quick scan of the audience. Yes, we have a question right there.
So, but the tricky thing is that when you talk about engagement and intervention, there is a social contract with the community that becomes really sticky for artists inside of the performance of it. You know, Suzanne, Animal Valley. You know, it's the community says, okay, so you're a different kind of art that I have access to. You're a different kind of artist, white person, outside of my community person, and I expect you to deliver something that has a residual in my community that I can bank on as a new kind of way to engage with the other, being outside artist, institution, doing something in my community that advances your career but leaves me dealing with the issues and the questions that you raise. So as you negotiate this social contract, sometimes it's not a question of whether you're an artist or not an artist, or whether you become an agency, but how do you define the contract or the agreement with the community. So like I need you to speak to that, because as someone who's having difficulty with this, because I can't draw the line. You know, it's like if it's not about change, then what is it about? Because I don't get this art for art's sake. You know, like I come from the change generation, and I look up continua and, you know, fight, but I gotta make this art, right? So please help.
I think one of the things, Scotty, is, as you know, you were the primary connection for the Black community in Antelope Valley, and one important key strategy on the issue of cross-cultural work is that you're working with a constituency of people that understand and come from similar experiences. I think that's a kind of a key practice that, like I said, I wouldn't do the Creative Time Project without a diverse 21 people, one man, multiple women, questioning, prodding, informing, offering perspective. But then it does come back to, I think, the balance between your social political life and your aesthetic life. And I don't think that's an easy thing to resolve. I deal with it all the time, but I think it's the foremost question when you're working. You have to keep it up there. Do they want postcards, or do they want, and what do I do with my postcards afterwards? And frankly, I only think a lifetime of work will demonstrate your authenticity in this area, not your race, you know, not your class, but your authenticity in the work process. Pretty soon it begins to add up, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think I understand what you mean. And one thing that I think about is that, you know, And John and I were talking about this, like, you get called as an artist. I'm just an artist, you know, I'm trying to pay my bills. And they're like, come make a piece in this city. We have a huge problem. These neighborhoods are really segregated. And it's partly due by how we did our public transportation 50 years ago. And can you do something that will bring all these people together? And you're like, I'll do it on this budget, I'll deliver by next year. So there's an expectation, there's this crazy expectation of what the artist can do. And there's incredible critique of the artists who try, but there's never any critique of the artists who don't even try. So I think you gotta try. And what I think is Arjuna Padurai, who writes a lot about globalization, says something that I always kind of keep in the back of my head. He says two things. One, he says, art can increase the archive of the possible. And I'm like, if I can just increase the archive of what's possible, and it can be visible for even a brief moment, that's huge. And the other thing that he says is, think of the biggest problem in the world and think of the smallest thing you can do to make it better. And then that also kind of is reassuring because I'm like, big problem, small action. Okay, got it. And, but I think social practice gets criticized a lot for not doing enough when it represents one of a tiny subsection of artists who are actually trying. So I tend to cut social practice artists a lot of slack in those terms, because I'm like, well, at least they're trying, you know, so, yeah.
I would simply add, too, that one of the things that seem quite visible through the presentations is that it's not always about the final action, but rather about creating the space for conversation, and that was happening through so many of your pieces that it's always hard to think of it as that goal-oriented, you know, that end piece, but as a platform as well. Are there more questions? Yes, right here. Oh, there's lots of questions. Great.
So first of all, thank you. Hi, is it working? Yeah. I just want to thank all of you for such incredible presentations. And as Suzanne mentioned, you all teach. So the question that I have has to do with the relationship between pedagogy and your performative practices. So the question is this: given the physical limitations, the financial limitations, that you are working in particular time and space, and you cannot, you know, change everything within that amount of time and space, no matter what it is. How do you navigate the tension between the sort of process of self-discovery or learning by doing, or the dialogical process that the spectators and participants experience themselves, versus your own agendas about how you wish them to have takeaways to kind of learn about the particular issue? And so I understand this can happen, you know, in a very ephemeral way, or it can happen through didactics, it can happen through mediation. But could you speak to that tension between having ideas about what you would like the reception or the learning to be through the experience of the work?
Yeah. Well, because I think a lot about this, I'm actually a whole lot more interested in, right now, in public pedagogy than art theory. There's a whole theory called public pedagogy, and it comes from critical pedagogy, which is interesting to me. Giroux and, you know, Herb Cole, actually people I know, operate in this area. What's interesting about it is it's both critical pedagogy. Nobody asked Freire to change the world, but in the middle of a classroom, he reconstructs the meaning of the relationships and the opportunity for different kinds of relationships to emerge. Bell Hooks talks about this as well. So in a way, I think that this describes our practice, that it's both intimate, a classroom, a project, but it's also got very deep political ramifications. So there's no, to me, the idea of, I don't actually come in with a data bank that I think people need to know. I enter very much as a learner in a reciprocal classroom, and I think most of us do. We're kind of curious about certain issues. I wouldn't work, for example, with anti-abortionists, but they tend not to want to work with me either. So, you know, we have our kind of set of values and pedagogies that are essentially frame how we interact, whether it's in the classroom or in an artwork. So I think there's some real interesting things to be learned about the relationship between pedagogy and art.
Yeah, and I grew up in Latin America, so in a way, even in a country that was fairly right-wing, but even within that, there was the influence of Paulo Freire is huge. So the idea that pedagogy, emancipation, changing the world, changing yourself, that was always in the air. So I don't see much of a difference between what's happening in the classroom and what I do as an artist. And no, because it's like I don't go into the classroom with an agenda necessarily as much as like, how can you facilitate that the classroom becomes a remaking of the world for those 3 hours. I mean, I'm not saying like I was like that since I was an adjunct the first time, but it's something that I've learned to, I feel like the two practices are working together, but they don't look the same. They don't have the same content, but they operate in similar ways.
I mean, just briefly, I mean, for the Conflict Kitchen, which is very much obviously like a public pedagogical project, and I was really interested in how I could take the utopia that we have in academia, in the the space to have conversations that are deep, rich, complicated, into the public realm, right? How can I make that available? How can I seduce people into those conversations with me so that we're all sort of co-learners. And so I often think that the public is informing us as much as we're informing the public, and we're just trying to basically create that space, in our plaza. And it's, in that way, it's very direct to the question of how pedagogy plays out into an artwork. But that said, I think, whether it's creating different types of, hierarchies within the works themselves and how those are reflected in, the communities that we create the works, I mean, that's pedagogical. I mean, it's all political and pedagogical. I don't think we parse it out so much. I mean, at least I don't parse it out too terribly much.
I just want to say one quick thing. Don't forget that pedagogy, or higher ed in particular, but education in general, is under deep, deep attack right now in this country. And I think that if you can think through your relationality as a mutual learning process, it helps counter the destruction of education that I think is going on.
I think we're approaching the end of our panel. We can take one last question. I know it's maybe right here. Yeah.
As I am in awe with all of your project, which, I've had tears, anger, all of those emotions. I'm also very worried about how government have been incorporated and how public practices might be filling a niche in the market, for us to fulfill what's missing in our society. So I don't know your thoughts about that.
Were you saying that
as if social practitioner, in a sense, as if capitalism has created like a gap where we fit in and we fulfill.
Like co-opted by the state in some capacity, sure.
Well, in England, there's a lot of critique about that because under Blair, what happened is that the social practice art world got brought in to solve certain social problems. So this critique comes up all the time in that environment. I think we're just living through a brief moment, and it's not going to go on forever. That there are issues about co-option when an institution takes on a practice, but what I've experienced is the issues become more like you're more attackable because you're seen as part of the system. And I've had a whole lot more controversy within my projects, like the bull ring in Ecuador, than I would have ever had 15 years ago. But I don't suspect that'll last. I think the art world is incredibly sophisticated in co-opting things, but only for a while.
Yeah, I think that fear is disproportionate. I agree with you. I think things come and go really fast, and there's an art world spotlight that makes it seem like every single artist in the world right now is becoming a social practitioner because, there's just so much money in it. And And I think that it will pass, but I think what's gonna leave behind, which is good, is I used to work what I thought was in total isolation, and I feel like now there's a discourse and there's pieces of infrastructure. We're also talking about this, like there's like yearly conferences that we can attend for practitioners. So I feel like what's going to be left behind is that people saw each other and we know who we are and people are communicating. And when the art world spotlight moves on, what I think will remain is like a connection between the people who are doing this work.
Yeah, I think what we've managed to accomplish, and I've been very much a part of this movement with like mapping the terrain and before, what we've managed to accomplish is make it okay to do this kind of work. And that's pretty much it. I can tell you in 1980, well, maybe 1970 to mid-80s, it wasn't okay to do this work, even when you were just starting. It wasn't a cool thing to do. You know, so now it's a cool thing to do. I don't think they'll ever get rid of that. It's okay to be a social practitioner.
Yeah, I think it'll have a residue. I don't think it'll have a spotlight.
It is okay to be a social practitioner.
It's okay.
Well, thank you all very much for your